Good evening. Today, ASQ Innovation Division brings you a very interesting webinar titled Business Model Innovation. Companies in many industries are experiencing disruption to their fundamental businesses. Others are seeking to capitalize on opportunities to create new business models to remain viable or achieve strategic growth goals. What role, if any, can performance improvement professionals play in the design or redesign of business models? This webinar will provide an overview of some of the latest thinking and practices in business model innovation. The learning objectives for this webinar is to define what a business model is, recognize the importance of business models to performance improvement professionals, describe sources of ideas, drivers for new business models, and summarize ways of constructing business models. Let's mention that Mrs. Brunell will be providing another more expanded presentation of the same topic at the ASQ Innovation Division Conference on October 14, 2017 in Dayton, Ohio. So participants are more than welcome to join her. A little bio for Mrs. Brunell. Kateri Brunell is Managing Director of Banyan Innovation Management, an independent consultancy specializing in concept development, process innovation, and Lean Six Sigma. She has recently been the Director of Enterprise Continuous Improvement at Aviall, Inc., Boeing Global Services, where her team worked at the intersection of improvement and innovation, as well as Director of Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt at ADT Security Services, Tyco International. In 2016, she co-developed a course in Lean Innovation and Management for Villanova University and serves as an adjunct faculty member. Ms. Kateri Brunell is also a Senior ASQ Member, ASQ Innovation Division Board Member, and holds several ASQ certifications, PMP for Project Management Institute, and New Product Development Professional from the Product Development and Management Association. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Mrs. Kateri Brunell. So Kateri, please take it away.
Okay, thanks, Jose, and greetings, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, and thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me this evening. I'm going to start by talking about a conversation I had with some friends of mine recently, and we were sitting around talking about all of the different businesses and products that we'd remembered from our childhood and onward, and lamenting like they've gone out of business or they're no longer part of the landscape. And so whether it was the milkman who used to deliver the milk, or the Life magazine subscription that my parents had when I was a kid, to the IBM Selectric typewriter that I learned on how to type on in college, all the way to the Borders bookstore, which was a favorite hangout of mine, all the way up to the time they closed. All of these companies have experienced someone or something else coming into the marketplace and basically disrupting the business model with something perceived to be better than what they had. And so it really made me think about the topic for tonight's webinar. Business model innovation, which is what all of these companies and several others that I'm sure you can think of, is what they've experienced, and it's also gaining a lot more attention from executives and academia lately. I'll just cite two studies very quickly that prove that point. In 2015, PricewaterhouseCoopers surveyed a number of CEOs about their concerns about new competitors, and 54% of CEOs that they surveyed said that they were indeed worried about brand new competitors coming into their market and basically disrupting. And at the same time, the same number said that they were thinking about doing the same in other industries. In addition, there's been studies by Boston Consulting Group of 1,500 senior executives in 2014, and 94% of these executives said that their companies had tried some form of business model innovation. There have been other studies, many more, and they pretty much echo these findings, that essentially leaders are coming to realize that the value that they've been gaining over the years from cost-saving efforts and product, service, and process innovation has largely been somewhat maximized, and that the business model is the next leverage point for providing the most value creation while also providing the greatest protection against competitive imitation. And if you think about the internet and digitization technologies as well as other trends, these are all also enabling new ways of thinking about the business model and disrupting the old way of doing things. So my main message tonight is basically, what does this have to do with performance improvement professionals? What I would like to state is that performance improvement professionals have much to offer to business model innovation efforts. If you don't believe this already, I hope in the next 45 minutes or so to convince you that this is a logical place for us to apply our skills and talents. Up till now, business model innovation, and I'm going to shorten that to BMI, so for brevity purposes, but BMI has mainly been discussions between executive ranks and the strategy groups in most companies. But I strongly believe that those of us who understand processes, quality of management systems, and business transformation deserve a seat at the table. So in this webinar, I'm going to be, first of all, giving you some definitions that have emerged historically as well as from recent studies from academia. I'll also present some components that seem to be what most people are now looking at as the logical components of a business model. And I'm going to give you some examples of how these components are fit together in new ways, as well as conclude with some ideas around how we can help as professionals in the performance improvement area help with the generation and regeneration of business models. So where do we start in talking about innovation and business models? I found it interesting, going back to the Malcolm Baldrige criteria, actually, as of the year 2000, managing for innovation has been a core value that was added in the year 2000 to the Baldrige criteria. And at the time it was added, they provided a definition of innovation that did not include business model. So in 2008, that was modified so that now when in the Baldrige criteria, when they talk about a definition of innovation, they call it making meaningful changes to improve your organization's products, services, programs, processes, operations, and business model with the purpose of creating new value for stakeholders. So if we're supposed to be now concerned about quality and innovation of the business model, along with everything else that we've been concerned with as performance improvement professionals, just what do we mean by a business model? Well, numerous definitions abound, but starting in the 1950s, the term business model emerged out of corporate practice, and it was really originally meant to mean something having to do with the way a company makes money. So Investopedia kind of reflects that tradition and defines a business model as the way in which a company generates revenue and makes a profit from company operations. So notice, again, there's a direct tie to how operations and how things get done. In the 1990s, academics started to increasingly look at business models as a distinct unit of analysis, and they came up with many, many definitions. In fact, some of the research that I did and have been doing into business models, articles have uncovered 14 different definitions of a business model. But needless to say, and again, that's actually the lack of a clear definition is actually what's hindered the research in this area. But there is some consensus now growing around the idea that a business model is the rationale of how an organization creates, delivers, and captures value. So the operative terms here are looking at the design and even the architecture of the three distinct ways an organization needs to approach innovation, and that is not only creating some new value, but delivering on it and then capturing it in the form of profits. So this definition is actually out of a book called Business Model Generation by Alex Osterwalder, but there have been other academicians that have more or less echoed that same definition. So why do I emphasize the business model definition? Because again, as people that have a very deep tradition in processes and how things operate from an operational and organizational system perspective, this is definitely within our wheelhouse. Okay, so I'm going to throw one more definition out you, and then I promise no more definitions and we'll move on. But the other definitions that have been in the literature have been, well, what is a business model innovation? And interestingly, according to academic researchers, BMI, or business model innovation, can be looked at as the process for designing novel, non-trivial changes to the key elements of a business model, or the architecture, or the outcome of that process. So in other words, you can define a business model innovation as, you know, the process of coming up with the innovative business model, or the outcome, which is the actual innovative business model that you come up with. And so in this talk, I'm going to speak mainly about the process of innovating a business model. Okay, if that makes sense to you. And as you can see in the picture here that all of these different concepts are embodied in what's in the business model. So to get more of a handle on, well, what can we offer to this effort, I was intrigued by some of the research that shows, even though that academics have been looking at this for about 15 or so years, seriously, and ASQ has, or Baldrige has included it in the purview of innovation since 2008, and ASQ now is included in its body of knowledge. We still have a long way to go of understanding really how business model innovations happen. And I like this quote that Clayton Christensen, who's a leading thinker in this area, has said recently. He said, there are a lot of lemons being produced by the business model innovation process, but it doesn't have to be that way. So if you think about some of the new businesses like in the .com era and even more recently that have come and gone because they were tried and they failed. And it's interesting, in the same article, which was in the Sloan Business Review, or Sloan Management Review rather, Christensen actually mentions Edward Deming in this article. And he said in the early 1970s, auto manufacturers accepted that some cars were going to be lemons. It was just the way it was. They didn't understand. And he says that until Deming demonstrated that manufacturing doesn't have to be random, quality of product improved. And so the point being is, once we understood that as a process and it didn't have to be random, you could put some scientific thinking to it, quality of automotive got better. And so Christensen is saying we're at that same juncture with business model innovation, and it needs to be looked at further. And so one of the things I looked at closely was the article that he wrote, where he actually reported on the results of a study he did of 26 different business models. And I thought the findings would be good to share because it's consistent with some of the other research that's been done, as well as some of the practical tools that are starting to emerge in this area. So in the article, he breaks the idea of a business model down into several components. There are 4 elements that are listed there. The first one is the value proposition, and that is basically what the company is providing to a target customer. Now, Christensen, I like what he does with value proposition, and again, it's very consistent with some of the other tools that we're going to share later on in this presentation. He defines the value proposition in terms of a customer job to be done. In other words, he sees that customers don't buy products or use services. What they do is they buy a product or service for the job that it will be done. They hire the product or service to do a job for them. And so if a product or service can, quote, do the job better than anything else, then that's the business model that's going to be more appealing in the marketplace. And so there's a whole way of looking at the jobs to be done because it maps the customer in the activities they go through in order to actually get that job accomplished. So it's a very process-oriented perspective. So element number 1 is the value proposition. Element number 2 are the resources. So once you know what the value proposition is, or the job that the customer wants to be done, and it's a specific customer with a specific job to be done, then the company needs to look at the resources that will be used to provide that, deliver that value proposition. These can include people, technology, products, facilities, etc. So if you think about it, resource usage efficiency is a hallmark of lean. And so again, the thinking that we provide as experts in that area could be valuable when using this model to create a business model. The next element are processes. So once you know what your value proposition is and the resources that are going to be needed to provide the value proposition, then the company has to think about, well, what are the ways that we're going to devise to create those recurring tasks or those repetitive processes so that it's consistently delivered to the customer. And again, this developing robust processes is something that many of us are very, very familiar with doing. The last component here is the profit formula. And so what is meant by this is how the cost structure of what it takes to provide the resources in relation to the value proposition and the money that is paid, or the revenues that are generated, as well as how quickly the money can turn over, will generate the right mathematics for the profit formula. So the idea here, there's a fifth component that's not specifically called out, and that's the interrelationships shown by these arrows. The important thing about business models is they're not just discrete elements. All of the pieces have to fit together holistically in a very synergistic way in order for the business model to work. And so how this is used is that companies will sit and design these different elements and iterate through until they find the optimal combination. And the interesting thing about this is that these four elements, as well as the interrelationships, are and can be impacted by performance improvement methods and practices. Another way of looking at more or less the same information is the business model canvas. And this is a tool that has become very popular in business schools as well as with startup companies, many of them in Silicon Valley. It's actually one of the key tools in the lean startup methodology. And many large companies are also adopting this as a framework for applying design thinking to the company's existing business model or to generate entirely new ones. And so I'll take a few minutes and go over this. Some of you may already be familiar with this, but others may not. So what it basically does, the business model canvas, is it breaks the business model into 9 distinct elements. And again, it's a lot of them are very much like the 4 elements that we saw on the previous slide. The only difference is some of them have been expanded into a little bit more detail. But you start with value propositions here in the middle, and that's directly the same as what was in the Christensen 4-element model. Basically, it uses jobs to be done to try to understand what's the key need that's being met, whether it's taking away a pain or affecting a gain for the customer. And then once you have the value proposition, you're looking at it in terms of a customer segment. And so there's got to be some congruity between the value proposition and the customer segment. The next one is the channels, and this is where you identify which distribution channels or which ways of producing and delivering the value to the customer. So it's how you get the value to the customer. And then customer relationships is the part of the business model where you specify how you're going to obtain the customer and maintain that relationship for the long term. So when you take the value proposition and the customer segment and how you're going to connect with the customers, that suggests what revenue streams your business model will be relying on. And those get listed here in this block. And then once you've done that, the value propositions, you then go towards the left and you specify what are the key activities that need to occur in order to deliver, create and deliver the value proposition. And then of those key activities, what are the key resources that will be involved, as well as the partners that you may need to bring into the mix to provide the key activities or the key resources. And then when you have all of these 3 together, the partners and the activities and resources, that suggests what cost structure your business model is going to have. And when you look at the cost structure and marry it to the revenue streams, that tells you if it's going to be a profitable business model or not. And so how this is typically used in practice is it's not a once and done kind of exercise. It's typically a team, and they start out basically with Post-it notes, putting their assumptions for all of the different pieces. And then they may work through and start testing the hypotheses about, well, does this value proposition really appeal to this customer segment? And they'll go out and do some rapid testing with customers to get feedback, and they'll iterate, and based on what they find out, they may change a few things. And like we saw on the previous diagram, these aren't just distinct pieces of information. They all have to fit together. So you may change something with the customer segment, which may make you have to change a channel, which may relate to different key activities and so forth. And so it's not uncommon for a team to go through several versions of this business model canvas before they come up with the final optimal design. So that's how the business model, conceptually works. Let's take a look now at an example of how this would work. And I'm going to actually use an example from an existing company and show how they use the business model canvas to basically show it to contrast their traditional business with a new business that they incubated out of their innovation group. And so the example I'm going to use is Daimler AG, which is a German automotive company, as you know, that makes, among other things, Mercedes-Benz cars. And so on their traditional business model, you can see that the value proposition is basically that they manufacture and sell cars, trucks, vans, buses. They also provide financial services, and I guess you could also add service to the car, maintenance. There's also an aspect of the brand, specifically the Mercedes brand, that plays into the value proposition as well, because it's an emotional value that customers have, that it has a psychological appeal. So there's an emotional value there that's being provided. The customer segments are the mass market, okay? And the way that they reach the mass market customers is through dealers and sales force. And then the relationships, they mainly have high-end brands, so the relationship is based on the brand identity that the consumer has with the car. And so they support it with various communications around the brand. When you look at the revenue streams, they're mainly traditionally looking only at vehicle sales and vehicle financing revenues. And I guess you could also add revenue from, servicing vehicles. On the left side of the canvas, the key activities are manufacturing and design, and the key resources are the vehicle plants, intellectual property, and the brands. And the key partners are the car parts manufacturers, so their supplier network. And then if you look at the cost structure, you have marketing and sales costs, manufacturing, and R&D. So notice how the idea here is not to put lots and lots of detail on these things. Using a business model canvas, it is kind of a lean thinking tool. At least I like to think of it that way, almost like A3. So you're really trying to just boil it down to the essence. There's obviously many other things they could have put here, but when they boiled it down to the essence of what makes the business model work, these are the elements that come out. So that's a pretty, I would guess, well understood model with this audience. So now let's look at what they did to innovate in an entirely new area. So the company's business executives actually got this started by deciding that they wanted to expand into the services area as a way to augment their traditional business model and the business revenue streams. And so they gave the challenge to the Business Innovation Division in Ulm, Germany. And that group came up with this concept, obviously looking at what trends were going on and looking at what kind of dynamic capabilities the traditional business had to offer. And so they came up with the concept of car-to-go. If you're not familiar with car-to-go, what it is in a nutshell, it's not like Uber. It's more like a disruption of the traditional rental car business model. So unlike current or traditional business rental agencies where you go to a centralized location or you make a reservation way in advance, car-to-go is actually being able to get a car to go point to point one way within a very defined geographic location, just from different areas. So, you know, different. So it's really focusing on individual urban mobility without car ownership, basically. So basically, picture somebody, you know, going down in a downtown area and deciding they need to go across town to go to a shop or something. So they would basically go to the car2go.com website or the mobile app, or some cities have actual designated parking lots with the car2go logo on them, or they may have cars kind of scattered around in different areas. And so when you look at the app, and you're able to then see where the cars are that are available, and you just take the one that's closest to you, come up to it, and there's a payment system, and you get the keys and you go off, and then you just drop it wherever you want to drop it. So the customer relationships are mainly through a one-off sign-up on their website. And I guess there's now a fee to do that. It's like $5. I don't know if that fee was in place in 2008 when they first started. But they, so they're targeting this to very specifically to city dwellers, typically, you know, the millennial type demographic. And the revenue model is based on a pay per minute. You can get down to just paying for only the minutes that you're using it. And it can also be an hourly and daily depending on what you need the car for. But this fee includes everything, the rental, the gas, the insurance, etc. So in order to provide that value proposition, there are certain key activities that they need to accomplish. One is fleet management. So you can imagine if you've got all of these cars, and by the way, the key resources, they're Smart for Two car, at least it was in 2008 when they first started. So this is Daimler's lowest end model. It's basically a smart car that fits two people. And so they had to have the way to manage the fleet and you know, have enough cars that are charged up and gassed up to be able to meet demand. So that's a key activity. Another activity is the telematics management. So telematics is the systems that actually put the intelligence in the car so that you can monitor the gas consumption, the mileage, whether it needs maintenance, and several other things that are kind of make the car into an intelligent piece of machinery. And then another key activity is cleaning. So obviously if somebody drops a car off, it's got to be cleaned and turned around quickly for the next person to rent. So the key resources to provide those key activities are the service team, the telematics systems themselves, and the Smart for Two car fleet. Their key partners they identified as city management. And the reason they identified city management, they had everything else pretty much within their traditional business, but the city management came out as key because since they're targeting cities and they're targeting leaving these cars in different areas spread out around the city, there were certain restrictions in Ulm, Germany, and places where they first started piloting this, to where they needed to have the barriers and parking restrictions lowered to be able to offer this service. So that was key. And then the cost structure was mainly the systems management and the fleet management. So as I mentioned, this concept was developed within the Business Innovation Department of Daimler. And they tested it first internally with a group of about 500 of their employees that were in the research area with 50 cars and about 200 family members. And after they tested it and got feedback, they then went a little bit broader, but still internal to Daimler, and they made it available to all of their Mercedes-Benz sales and service outlets within Germany. And that was another 50 cars that they tested it on. So that was around 2008, 2009 timeframe. Once they got the concept further refined, then they went out to the whole city of Ulm, Germany, which was about 120,000 people or citizens that it was made available to. Tested it with them, and then at the same time planned a two-stage pilot within the city of Austin, Texas, which was 750,000 customers potentially. And so as they did that, they refined the model, and then finally in about 2010, as they were piloting it within Austin, it was sort of commercialized at that point. And they hadn't really decided at that point whether they were going to keep it inside the company or spin it off and sell it. And so where are they today? Well, Car2Go, as of 2017, is the largest car sharing company in the world. Daimler did decide to keep it instead of spinning it off. It is now part of their strategic portfolio for offering connectivity and in the Internet of Things kind of world. It's within their Daimler Financial Services business unit, so it's not mingled with the traditional business, and which is a smart way to keep the two business models separate. They, as of last month, they had 2.5 million registered users and 14,000 vehicles in 26 locations, including North America, Europe, and Asia. And within North America, they've got 6 or 7 cities in Canada, which include Toronto, Vancouver, and so forth. And then in the United States, they have Austin, of course. They have Denver, Columbus, Ohio, New York, and a couple of others. So it's been a very successful model. Getting revenue information is very hard, but the business unit that Daimler or Car2Go is in Daimler, which is the Financial Services Group, had about $20 billion in revenue in last year's annual report. And so there are a couple of other, or 2 or 3 other business units within financial services. So I'm not sure how much Car2Go was of that, but I have to believe it's a pretty big chunk of that 20 billion. So, and that was, here's a model that was conceived in 2008, and 7 short years later, it's, a multi-billion-dollar business. So that is one example. There have been others that have used the business model canvas. I'll just mention very briefly that the company I was last involved with was part of Boeing, and it was Boeing actually is using this a lot, and they've also decided to get into the service area of the economy, and they had launched Boeing Global Services last month. And the idea of that business model is very much like Car2Go. It's to leverage off of the existing capabilities and technologies and so forth that the airplane manufacturer has. So to be able to offer services to supply parts, repairs, lease vehicles, provide pilot training, and a host of other services, including data services, to the aerospace industry. So it's pretty exciting. And again, they've used business model canvassing for some of their innovations. So another concept that a lot of CEOs are concerned about too is the business model ecosystem. So if you're thinking about the breadth of the organization and how all those pieces fit together, it's considered from academia as well as business practice very smart to keep your mind on the whole ecosystem, not just your own business model. And what I've provided here is some information from a company called Venture Scanner Insights. This group has done a lot of these kind of graphics for other industries, but this one is the connected transportation segment of the automotive industry. And so you'll notice car sharing, there's 53 companies that they've found that are currently operating in the car sharing space. Obviously, Car2Go is one of them, even though it's not shown here. Notice the telematics, which is also part of the ecosystem, as well as fleet management, and several others, smart parking, and so forth. So this is kind of an interesting example because they found that 702 companies are currently operating in this ecosystem, and they encompass 17 categories and about $24.7 billion in investment. And most of these are startups, by the way. And so it's a lot to pay attention to if you're in an incumbent business. So you can imagine the CEOs of GM, Ford, Toyota, Honda, and others, including Daimler, are probably very interested in what's emerging in this space. So just one other example I could add to this, sort of to reinforce the concept of performance improvement does have a place in this. When I worked at ADT, we were actually having a deal with Ford Motor Company to provide vehicles for our service and installation teams. And the vans were outfitted by Ford with telematics capabilities that were provided by Hughes, which is listed here. And in addition, GE Fleet Management, which is in this other block, provided the services for tracking the vehicle usage and maintenance, including the data. So between Hughes and GE, our vans at ADT became smarter. So we were actually involved with that project because I had 2 black belts that worked on the projects to integrate these telematics-enabled fleet and provide the metrics and reporting. And we even had to go in and redesign some of the local branch management processes to fully capitalize on using the data and the reporting capabilities. So a lot of times as performance improvement professionals, we get called in on the back end to help execute on the strategies and the business models, and that's okay. That's a logical place for us to be involved. What I'm trying to suggest here is that there's also a place for us at the front end of that process as well. Now I'm going to shift gears a little bit here and go back to some of the data that Clayton Christensen pointed out in this Sloan Management Review. So you recall we talked earlier about the 4 elements. And one of the other things that came out of his research of the 26 business models, which, by the way, he looked at both successful and unsuccessful business models to try to establish some kind of cause and effect relationship there. And one of his findings was that business models are not static. They evolve over time. And because they evolve over time, there's different types of innovation that are occurring at different points in their life cycle. And they also, the 3 phases, if you will, have different objectives, metrics. They call into play different skills and tools at each of these phases. So the first one, in the creation phase, this is where you're really trying to establish your value proposition. In other words, you're trying to find the customer and find that mix of resources and value proposition that's going to constitute the business and help it to grow. And so by focusing there, the emphasis is less on the processes in the beginning and even on the profit formula, and more on finding that true value proposition. Once that hurdle is passed and the market forms and the business begins to grow, then the attention of the business shifts to providing the more sustainable processes, you know, the infrastructure to help the companies manage the growth and to accommodate the growth. And things become more standardized. And now the interrelations are between the value proposition, the processes, the resources. Again, there may not be as much emphasis on the profit formula, but the value proposition and the voice of the customer, which again was strong here in the creation phase, carries over into the sustaining phase. But now we also start to get some processes in place. And the more that this is done and the more that it contributes to the growth of the company, then the company moves into the efficiency phase. And this is where all of these interrelationships are now hardwired into the business model. And any innovation is really focused on squeezing out more and more efficiency, because now the emphasis is not so much on the customer, but it's on the shareholders and providing return on capital. So a lot of the efficiency, you know, we're very familiar with that, at least in the Lean Six Sigma world. This seems to be where we spend a lot of our time, unless we're in design for Six Sigma, which may be more in the sustaining, depending on how radical the designs are. But the point here is that once the business model gets to this point, it becomes very stable and very resistant to change. And the key threat is that it will become a victim of its own success and vulnerable to some other startup that's in the creation phase that is now paying more attention to the customers or noticing a customer job to be done that this company with this more traditional business model has overlooked. So it suggests that there are different objectives, skills, and tools required at each of these phases. And again, as performance improvement professionals, if we're clued into where the business model is in its evolution or where it needs to be regenerated, we can provide that input to our management and demonstrate how we can offer some skills and talents to help make, support those efforts. So specifically, I'll wrap it up here with just a summary of ways I I believe process improvement professionals can add value to BMI. One is the organizational system viewpoint. Out of all of the different functional areas, we in the performance improvement field have traditionally been steeped in looking at organizations as total systems. And so providing that viewpoint is very important. And again, with the Malcolm-Baldrige criteria, that codifies a lot of what we've learned over the years about what it takes to have a high performance in a company. Secondly, we come to the table with an improvement mindset. We traditionally look at things and notice the gaps and say, what do we need to make it better? You know, how do we move it from where it is now to where it needs to be? We may have to shift our thinking a little bit and say, how do we create problems or find problems or opportunity finding versus, you know, defect finding? But once we shift our lens a little bit, that same improvement mindset should serve us well and is a good stimulator on a design team. Third, we have traditionally have expertise with focus on database decisions and outcomes, especially if we're in Lean Six Sigma. We're always looking for, you know, the Y equal F of X formula, if you will. You know, what's the cause and effect relationship? How do we show it with data? You know, how do we know what we know? How do we have the right operational definitions and the right metrics and so forth? Fourth, typically the work that we do is in the project area. So if we're good at what we do, we're also good at project management. Now there are others in the company that are also skilled with project management, specifically the IT area, or maybe depending on what industry you're in, there may be some other project managers. But again, this is something, when we make improvements or innovations, they're done in projects. They're executed in a project-like fashion. And so project and portfolio management skills are values that we can provide, as well as change management. Anytime you make an improvement, you're making a change. Well, innovation is just another type of change, and the business model is another thing to make a change too. So it's thinking through all of the relationships of processes and people and technology that need to change, and making sure that it's done in a systematic way is you know, a hallmark of the kind of work that we typically do. So those are some high-level ways that we can add value. More specifically, if you look at each of those three phases, in the creation phase, the customer jobs to be done, I mentioned earlier, that's typically done by mapping the steps that the customer is doing when they're expecting to do the job that they need to have done. And it's a matter of, you know, examining, well, how can we do that step for them better, cheaper, faster than they could do it for themselves. So it's you know, process mapping with a little bit of a different twist in your lens. You could be doing customer jobs to be done type analysis. Similarly, benchmarking, there are a number of ways to take benchmarking and do it a little bit differently, looking for analogs or archetypes, if you will, or patterns that have worked other places and applying them to new situations. That's very much like what trees is, where you've got different patterns of solutions that have already been worked out in one context that can be applied in another. There's experimentation. Again, if you've been through Lean Six Sigma training, specifically designed experiments and sequential experimentation as it's practiced in Lean Startup, that's a skill that's needed in the creation phase, as well as other design for Lean Six Sigma tools that are used for breakthroughs such as QFD and, again, trees, affinity analysis, and so forth. In the sustaining phase, where we switch over to more incremental innovation and, you know, growing on the base that we've already built, it's typical Lean Six Sigma projects that are mainly focused on revenue and income growth, as well as the change management and the doing design for Six Sigma for line extensions, typically. And then in the efficiency phase, this is probably closest to what we've traditionally done in performance improvement. Lean Six Sigma projects, project management that's focused on cost savings projects, change management. We may even get into some organizational redesign, such as re-engineering systems, maybe outsourcing different parts of the business. So that would be more of a process redesign kind of tool set. What I would like to do at this point is reference that there's some excellent work that my predecessors and colleagues have done in this area. You might want to look at Nicole Radziwill's guide to business model innovation. It's a quick reference guide that was in the November 2016 newsletter for the division. And I believe in that same issue, Jane Keithley talked about some of the non-traditional tools. So there are some more detailed examples of how some of these tools have been used or could be used in some of the other resources that we have on our website. With that, I know that was kind of a quick ending there, but I'd like to ask if there's anybody that has any questions, and I would love to answer that for you.
Hey, Kateri, thanks so much for this amazing presentation. There's in the Q&A section on the there's one question. Let me read that out loud. So, do the large organizations use silos as examples, use the business model canvas only as a strategy planning tool, or do they find it useful for day-to-day operations as the business model is executed? Do they keep it updated as the business model evolves? That's the question.
I'd have to say, honestly, the only large companies I've seen using it mainly were the Boeing example I showed earlier or mentioned earlier. I think large companies have been slow to come to this tool set, and I think they're mainly using them in the strategy area just as sort of a brainstorming tool. If you want to really know how to use the business model canvas, you really need to go to the startup community, because it's actually a tool that's embedded within the Lean startup methodology, and it's used as a framework for organizing all of the different hypotheses that you test in the build, measure, learn cycle. So I would have to say that they're probably in their infancy stages of using it, and it may not be used the right way. I'm on the lookout for examples, so if anybody does have an example from their company that they can at least say they're doing it differently, I'd be more than happy to hear that. But I know ADT did not use the business model canvas. Maybe they're using it now. I haven't spoken to them in a while. But I know Boeing uses it in some of the areas as well. And I know GE is using it. Procter & Gamble is using it in areas. But again, I think it's mostly, to your point, more in the strategy area. So, but I would add to that I think it's an excellent idea for process improvement professionals to start using it to just to analyze the existing business model and make sure that use it as a tool for discussing, are we in alignment? Is our business model still relevant, or can it be tweaked in some areas?
No, that's great. No, that definitely makes sense. I think that definitely answers the question. So, Kateri, so we are pretty much within the hour. I don't think there's much more time for questions, but really appreciate the presentation, very informative. Participants are saying thank you very much and relaying those.
Do you mind if I just say one more announcement?
Of course, yes, go ahead.
And if any of you are interested in business model innovation or innovation in general, our division has recently set up a LinkedIn group. So it's ASQ Innovation LinkedIn group. You can search LinkedIn and you'll find it. By all means, go out and join that group, and we can continue sharing ideas, and you can ask more questions there. At the same time, if you're not comfortable yet using LinkedIn, actually these are references that I used. I will be making these slides available, and I guess they will also be on the Innovation Division website. But if anyone's interested in contacting me, here's my email address as well as my phone number, and then my personal LinkedIn if you want to reach me one-on-one if you have any other questions that we weren't able to get to tonight. But I want to thank you, Jose, for your kind introduction, and thank you again, all of you, for taking time out of your busy schedules. And hopefully we'll see you next month, or in October, I guess, in Dayton. Okay?
Great. Thank you very much, Kateri. And just to remind participants that this webinar was recorded, and we're going to be uploading it into our YouTube channel. So on YouTube, just search for ASQ Innovation, and you should be able to find our page. Also, our next webinar is scheduled for September 18th. We're going to be having a presenter discussing about innovation as a management response to disruption. And this is more about an experience from the front lines of healthcare policy reform. So thank you very much again, Kateri, and thank you all participants for joining us this evening. Have a good night.